Welcome to Optimize Your Brain. We're glad for each one of you in the live audience as well as each one joining us by screen. We're going to have two major sections to Optimize Your Brain. This section is going to be dealing with intelligence, and the following section will be dealing with emotional intelligence. And actually both are critically important. General intelligence is simply the capacity to learn, retain, and apply knowledge. And so those three aspects are very much related to IQ. And our school systems are pretty good at teaching the learning part and the retaining part to some extent. Not so good at the application part. And of course, as educational reform progresses, we're looking for better ways to instill the application part because it actually makes the first two easier as well if we do a better job with that. It's often measured by an IQ test. It's an imperfect measure. There's no perfect measure as far as establishing precisely what the IQ is. But it's the best measurement we have, and it does a fairly good job at estimating the individual's ability to learn, retain, and apply knowledge. IQ is related somewhat to academic performance. You would think it would be related just completely to academic performance because, learning, retaining, and applying knowledge, isn't that what we're testing people over? But actually, have you met someone with very high IQ who didn't necessarily do well in school? Yeah, the problem there is not IQ, the problem is EQ. One of the aspects of emotional intelligence is motivation. In fact, emotion has that word motion in it. And if we don't have the proper motivation, that's an EQ problem, not an IQ problem. And then there's also people with average intelligence who have done very, very well in school because they have that motivation and they really take the due diligence necessary, even though it's more of a struggle for them. Graduates' first job after graduation has been found to be related to IQ. And this is well known, it's been studied several times, but when we take a look at IQs and the first job that you get after your education is complete, there is a linear relationship to how good that job is in relationship to the IQ. However, how far you advance in that job is no longer related to your IQ. And some people with high IQ have misunderstood that because they thought high IQ was all that mattered. And now they're seeing lower IQ people promoted in the workplace and not them. They'll often tell me it's because their bosses don't have a high enough IQ to recognize their IQ, and thus they're being passed over for promotion. But in reality, that's not the reason at all. What is being recognized is their EQ. How far you progress in leadership and in job has more to do with your EQ than your IQ. One of the reasons why you don't want to miss the EQ section. But there are some significant advantages to IQ. This was a large study of men and women followed since childhood, starting from 1922 until 1986. I like those long-term studies where we follow large groups of people over many years because they can reveal to us a lot. The researchers found that up to the cutoff point of 163, when we're getting up there to 163, this is in the 99.9 percentile. There's very few people that have an IQ that high. But it did look up to that point. Participants' risk of dying during a given period decreased as their IQ increased. What does this mean? Well, let's give an example. If someone with a childhood IQ was studied with 150, that person had a 44% lower risk of death than those with an IQ of 135. In other words, they lived longer. And so every that 15-point increment, we saw that significant difference in longevity. And of course, that begs the question, why? Why is IQ so much related to health and longevity? And I think we'll get some clues, actually, in this presentation right here. We also need to dispel some of the myths about intelligence. There are a lot of myths that tend to be out there. One of them is that genetics is all that matters. Now, is genetics important when it comes to IQ? It actually is. important. If your father and mother were very intelligent, there's a chance that you've got a brain that has that capacity as well, as far as intelligence is concerned. It's not across the board, however. It's well known to have very bright mother and father, and children not so bright. And then there's also cases where mother and father were not so bright, and one of the children at least just rises to the top in regards to IQ. So genetics isn't all that matters, but one of the reasons why it's thought to be that way is that this world, at least in America, most Americans are being raised in a uniform way. You know, they watch the same shows, they eat the same food. They do have a little difference. They have a different home maybe than someone else, different mother and father. But by and large, it's a very standard, uniform way that they're being raised. Same educational system, etc. And so what seems to emerge when everything is constant is what's different. And what is different is the genetics. And so that's what seems to surface. But actually, it's very clear that genetics actually has a smaller role to play than the other factors that we're going to be discussing today. There's nothing you can do about it after age 18 is another myth. Now, this is also thought to be true because the average person who takes an IQ test at age 18 and they take it again at age 30, they assume with that 12 years of additional education and life experiences, etc., that their knowledge base is greatly increased. And most of them anticipate to have had their IQ go up. They take the IQ test, and pretty much it's the same. Now, why is that the case with all of their learning? Well, the IQ tests don't test how much knowledge you have. They're testing your capacity to learn, retain, and apply future knowledge. And so in most people, it does stay the same because their lifestyle isn't vastly different from age 18 from what it was at age 30. They're kind of eating the same foods, same type of program, etc. They haven't really embarked on a program to significantly improve their IQ. But I can tell you that is clearly untrue. We've had many individuals who've come to us who've barely made it through high school. And I've talked to their teachers about how they almost pushed them through, felt sorry for them, etc., and let them go through. And then later on, they found out about our program, and they started changing their lifestyle accordingly. And within a few years, they were taking classes like college chemistry and physics and biology, and then just with a few short years after that, they were being admitted to medical school. They didn't have that low IQ anymore. Their IQ had significantly increased. And we've had many individuals, we have run peak mental performance programs for individuals, for instance, who want to become physicians, but just haven't had the wherewithal to do so, and come to our programs, and now are able to pass their tests and their MCATs and get admitted because their capacity goes up. And it's pretty dramatic. Another myth is that people that are highly intelligent are generally irritating to be around. Now, this myth is perpetuated because some people that are highly intelligent are irritating to be around. But it turns out that you're actually no more likely or less likely to be irritating to be around than a person of low IQ or average IQ. What that is taking a look at is the EQ part. One of the reasons is people with high IQ don't necessarily have high EQ. They're not related per se. And so the willingness or the ability to be able to get along with others and have those good relationships is related to the emotional intelligence part. And that's where the big differences would surface. But it really doesn't have anything to do with IQ. Another myth, people that are highly intelligent lack common sense. Now, this is, I think, thought to be true because many of the great intelligent individuals in our country, Albert Einstein was one, he would frequently get lost on his way home from work. And he'd end up several streets off, and he'd just, he'd have to reorient and try to find out where he was at to get home. And it really wasn't because he lacked common sense. He was just so focused in thought in regards to the project that he was working on that everything else kind of faded away from him, and that's why he had to reorient. And there are examples of people with high IQ that lack some common sense in certain areas. Just because you have high IQ doesn't mean that you know everything. I can tell you there's very high IQ people, even that one of 163, I can guarantee you there's some things that that person doesn't know that someone with an IQ of 80 does know. Actually what the studies show is quite the reverse, though. People that are highly intelligent actually have more common sense in general than people that are of average or lower intelligence. Another myth, you can't improve it, so why try? I think we've already disproven that one. Well, in regards to intelligence, the entire brain really needs to be looked at, because the entire brain is involved in it. The cerebellum possibly less so, because the cerebellum has to do with coordination, more of the physical things. In fact, when sports teams get together to compete, they're actually determining which team has a better corporate cerebellum. They don't recognize that, but that's what they're doing. Those are the ones that have that coordination and grace and are just fun to watch in their athleticism. Occipital lobe is where vision is centered. It's also where architectural skills are. Some of our spatial orientation things have to do with the occipital lobe. The parietal lobe is very much related to IQ. It not only has to do with sensation, but it has to do with vocabulary, it has to do with language comprehension, it has to do with speech making, and also even mathematics is there as far as addition, subtraction, multiplication. Einstein had a little larger parietal lobe than most other human beings. The frontal lobe, before we get to the frontal lobe, before that is the temporal lobe. Temporal lobe is where your memory is. So if your temporal lobe isn't working, you might learn it, but if you don't retain it, it's not going to end up as helping your IQ. And so you really want to retain it. The hippocampus is an area of the temporal lobe that's very much connected with getting those long-term memories there. And then, of course, the temporal lobe is also involved in music, one of the reasons why music can help memory. But frontal lobe is the area that really we need to study, because it has a lot to do with intelligence and emotional intelligence. This is the one lobe where the EQ and the IQ are connected. Science first began to understand the importance of the frontal lobe of the brain as a result of the story of Phineas Gage. Phineas Gage was the foreman of a railroad crew. His employer says he possesses an iron will as well as an iron frame. He was muscular, had a lot of endurance, and was a great guy. He was well liked by his fellow workers. He was a religious man. He regularly attended church. In fact, he taught his weekly Sunday school class. He was noted to be intelligent and insightful, and this also was written about him. Quotes, "the most efficient and capable foreman in our employ." Then came that day of September 13, 1848, that permanently altered Phineas Gage's future. What was he doing? He was actually blasting granite. And we're not sure. It was later in the day, one of the last blasts that they were going to do. But Phineas had placed the gunpowder in, and he had placed the fuse. And after that, it's a little unclear what took place. Whether Phineas's blunt end of the tamping bar came down directly on gunpowder, in other words, his helper may have filled up the entire hole by mistaken with gunpowder, or more likely, what seems to be the case, is that the tamping bar was dropped accidentally down into the hole with the blunt end going first. And when it was dropped, a spark occurred. That hole became a gun barrel, and Phineas was right there as it had dropped, and an explosion occurred, and as a result, that tamping bar went through the eye of Phineas Gage and out the top of his head and landed about 20 feet away from the scene. It totally knocked Phineas Gage over. Within a few seconds, he was up and walking around. There was blood pouring down his face. And he was talking about the accident. What was amazing is that he was walking around, and in fact, the rest of the men kind of had to restrain him to put him on a carriage to take him back into town to see a doctor. amazingly, Phineas survived the accident. Within a few weeks, he was back on the job again. But he was no longer Phineas Gage. This was written about him. Gage is no longer Gage. He's now fitful. He's irreverent. He's indulging at times in the grossest profanity, manifesting but little deference for his fellows, impatient of restraint or advice when it conflicts with his desires. And they had to let him go as foreman of the railroad crew. He was written about as childlike in his intellectual capacities now and manifestations, yet has the animal passions of a strong man. Years later, he died from a seizure in San Francisco. And his doctor found out about it and asked for his body to be exhumed and brought back to the Boston area. He had been presented as a case in Harvard after this occurred. A number of doctors came around. All of those notes are taken. Phineas himself told his story of the accident. The doctor told his story. And of course, the amazing thing is someone with a huge head injury like that survived. And many of the doctors doubted that it actually happened, doubted that it went through all the way through the skull. There was a lot of controversy about that until Phineas was brought back in this form after his death. And you can see there that the top portion of the skull that had been indeed blown away, and this is why he survived. It was an open head injury, and if a closed head injury occurs, you get swelling, and then your brain herniates through the brainstem, and you can't live. You quit breathing. But with an open head injury, the swelling came out. That portion of the brain that had that whole circle there around it rose up, and Phineas survived the accident. But what we did learn from that whole aspect of things is what happens when people lose a large portion of the frontal lobe of their brain as far as IQ and as far as EQ is concerned. Animals have frontal lobes as well. Cats have a small brain to begin with, but only 3.5% of a cat brain is in the frontal lobe. Not much morality in a cat if you've seen it torture its victims to death and seem to enjoy it. And that's simply because of that low amount of frontal lobe. Dogs have a little more frontal lobe. They're able to exhibit more empathy. Their capacity to learn, retain, and apply knowledge is a little bit higher than a cat. They won't hesitate to murder if they have to, though, but they do it much more mercifully, and probably due to that greater frontal lobe. Chimpanzees have the most of any other animal creature, 17%, but what sets us apart so far from the rest of the animal kingdom is our frontal lobe size. 33 up to 38% of the human brain is in the frontal lobe. And this is what gives us the ability to accomplish advanced planning and thinking, and the abilities that have been clearly demonstrated from man's creative ability. Since the time of Phineas Gage, it's well reported in neurology textbooks the effects of compromised frontal lobes. When the frontal lobe is compromised for whatever reason, there's an impairment of moral principle that occurs. If we want to follow the decline of morality in any society or any age, it actually is very much related to the decline or the enhancement of frontal lobe function if there's been an enhancement in morality. Social impairment also occurs. In Phineas's case, he really didn't have much use even for his mother and father and brothers and sisters after that. Had difficulty getting along with them, couldn't live with them for very long. That loss of love for family occurred. And often when that natural loss of love for family occurs, it's often due to a frontal lobe impairment. Lack of foresight occurs. Our ability to reason from cause to effect is a frontal lobe function. You can follow your child's frontal lobe development by how far they are planning for the future. And it takes the brain actually 30 years to fully anatomically form in the frontal lobe of the brain. So even though your 18-year-old doesn't seem to be doing much advanced planning or thinking, you need to take heart. His frontal lobe isn't fully developed yet, and maybe listening to this program will help develop him some more. But hopefully he gets to the point where he's recognizing his need to plan appropriately for his career, make wise choices in regards to marriage partner, etc. When the frontal lobe is compromised, abstract reasoning is impaired. Our ability to interpret proverbs and think in the abstract is a frontal lobe phenomenon. Mathematical understanding is diminished. Now, I mentioned math is the parietal lobe, but advanced forms of math, calculus, advanced algebra require the frontal lobe. Empathy, very much related to the frontal lobe. Phineas Gage just lost his ability to empathize with others, and that's why he really had so much trouble getting along with them. When the empathy is gone, you can be sure that there is significant problems with the frontal lobe. Lack of restraint occurs, and so you tend to get boasting, hostility. Phineas would lose his temper in a short, abrupt manner. He would apologize afterwards, but he just would frequently go through that loss of temper. Well, we now know that, of course, we can have frontal lobes compromised for more reasons than just head injury. And this recent study out of Israel shows that the frontal lobe can get so compromised that the individual can become psychopathic. People diagnosed as psychopathic have difficulty showing empathy. Notice, just like patients who have suffered frontal head injury. The new study from the University of Haifa showed that people who have psychopathic symptoms behave as though they are suffering frontal brain damage, said Dr. Simone Shamit-Soray. And so we know that this type of compromise can occur without mechanical damage. And of course, there's often degrees. This is when it gets more severe, where it's very noticed. But there's degrees of frontal lobe function and enhancement, and you'll get some evidence of this here in a little bit. As far as interpreting Proverbs, this might give you a little idea in regards to your own frontal lobe function. A chain is as strong as its weakest link. What does that mean? I've asked that in a high school recently, and the first answer I got is, well, the weakest link will, that's where it's going to break. That's what we call concrete reasoning. It's not the abstract, not the interpretation of the proverb. More frontal lobe function is needed. You can catch more flies with honey than with vinegar. What does that mean? Again, you need to think in the abstract. It doesn't mean what it appears to mean, or what it appears to say. Do not put all your eggs in one basket is another proverb. People that live in glass houses shouldn't throw stones. I gave that example at a high school in Texas not long ago, and one of the kids in the front said, well, if you do that, you're going to break your house. I said, no, that's not the correct interpretation. A couple of more tried, kind of said variants of the same thing, and then finally a kid in the back came forward and he says, if you don't want to be picked on, you better not pick on somebody else. That's correct, and the place broke out in thunderous applause for this young man. And then I asked him, how many of you think that your parents would have been able to get that proverb right? What percent of the kids do you think raised their hand in Texas? Actually, it was well over 80%. I mean, the hands went up. And I said, you know what, you're right. I think your parents could have interpreted that proverb. Then I told them how it took 30 years for the frontal lobe to fully develop. And if they couldn't interpret that proverb, there's a whole lot of other things they didn't understand yet. And so they still needed to rely upon the wisdom of their parents, at least until they were 30. There are diseases that can result from significant frontal lobe compromise. Mania or bipolar disorder. Obsessive compulsive disorder is a problem with the frontal lobe of the brain, one of the anxiety disorders. Even obesity. Appetite increase. Did you know that your highest center of appetite control is actually in the frontal lobe of the brain? Now, that's not where we feel desire or hunger. Where we feel desire or hunger is a lower brain function. It's right there at the lowest part of the brain. But no matter how much desire we might have for something, if our frontal lobe is fully intact, we can say no to that desire. And that's important to recognize. Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder is a problem with frontal lobe development in children. And then this disease that has become rampant in our society today, with about 1 in 2 females having a lifetime risk of major depression, 1 in 4 males. This problem is primarily related to frontal lobe circulation. In fact, research in the last 15 years shows that one of the main characteristics of virtually all depressed individuals, no matter what the underlying cause, is a significant decrease in the frontal lobe's blood flow and activity. This is a SPECT scan. This is a scan that looks at regional blood flow, and it's like Doppler weather radar. The hotter the color, the more the circulation. This is a cross-section of the brain. It's showing a little bit of the anatomy, but at the top of the brain is where the frontal lobe is. That's where the eyes would be. And you can see in a depressed individual, the entire brain circulation is down. But this is the same brain now after they have recovered from depression. And you can see the entire brain circulation is up, but the vast, biggest before and after difference is right there in the frontal lobe of the brain. In fact, you're seeing those red hot areas of great circulation occurring in the frontal lobe of the brain. And so if we're really going to undergo a complete cure for depression, we have to get the patient on a program that enhances frontal lobe function. Otherwise, we're just going to be covering symptoms and not really taking care of the problem long term. Well, other ways that you can impair your frontal lobe are simply by drugs. All of the illicit drugs do this, whether it's amphetamines, cocaine, marijuana, heroin, narcotics. These things will actually decrease the circulation and activity of the frontal lobe of the brain. And while they're doing that, they actually may help the person feel better. When your frontal lobe circulation goes down, you don't have any difference in feelings necessarily. In fact, you kind of lose some of your inhibition, so in some ways you have this sense of freedom, but it's not real freedom that's occurring. Then there's prescription drugs that can impair it. Some of those drugs that are frequently used are the benzodiazepines, things like Valium and Xanax and Ativan. And of course, sometimes those drugs are necessary in certain situations, but we always have to weigh the benefits versus the risks. And we certainly don't want to be on those meds long term if they can be avoided, because they start decreasing our own ability to make chemicals that enhance frontal lobe function and help control ourselves, like GABA, etc. There are legal drugs that impair. Alcohol actually adversely affects the frontal lobe of the brain first before it affects any other portion of the brain. So the frontal lobe tends to be a very sensitive area of the brain. If you were to arrest someone who was driving at the legal limit of alcohol intoxication in most states in the United States, which is 0.08%, and you got them out of the car and you had them walk a straight line, do you think they'd be able to do that? They actually could. In fact, if they were skilled at doing so, and this has been done actually in professional baseball games, I'm sorry to say, but it's been done in professional baseball games. These baseball players, some of them have had alcohol problems, and they will drink before the game right there at the legal limit, and they will still be able to hit a curveball out of a baseball park. That's how well their coordination is at that point. So why is it then that they're 10 times as likely to get into an automobile accident? It's not their coordination, it's their judgment. And that's exactly what happened to Princess Di's driver. He was walking straight lines, he was conversing normally, no one recognized that he was drunk, but he had attempted to negotiate a turn at a speed in a tunnel that was impossible to negotiate, even under the best of coordinated circumstances. Studies have revealed that the best race car driver in the world would not have been able to successfully negotiate that turn at that speed. And thus he lost his life and others lost their life as well. Now, after someone quits drinking in that situation, if they're up there where the frontal lobe is compromised but the cerebellum isn't, by the way, sometimes it's actually a safer drunk where the coordination is off, because the drunk might recognize, hey, I'm not able to really drive this thing, and so they slow down and they try to, compensate for it. Sometimes it's more dangerous when your coordination is good and you recognize it's good because you have no clue that your judgment is that far down. But nonetheless, does it require critical abstract thinking to drive an automobile? No. Clearly it doesn't, because we allow 16-year-olds to do it on a regular basis. But there are some things that require critical abstract thinking. And studies show that once alcohol is on board, it takes 2 weeks for the brain to fully recover to be able to do the highest form of thinking and abstract thinking. And that's one of the reasons why alcohol is best avoided. Nicotine has a more subtle effect in suppressing the frontal lobe of the brain. And the most commonly consumed drug in America, caffeine, also has a role to play. Anyone want to guess what percent of people in America have this on board, at least on a daily basis? Almost 80%. And what caffeine does is it blocks the adenosine receptors in the frontal lobe of the brain. And Pavlov has studied this out. Typists can type a little bit faster under the influence of caffeine, but they make 10 times as many errors. One of the stimulation effects is it blocks an enzyme called acetylcholinesterase, making too much acetylcholine. This is why people feel stimulated. But over time, when you use it on a habitual basis, your neurons make less acetylcholine to compensate for that destruction in enzyme. And of course, for years it was wondered which, was it really the down-regulating to the precise degree, or it seemed that caffeine still provided stimulation for these people on a habitual basis. Study was done in Bristol University recently on this. Before we get to this, though, there are other adverse effects of caffeine besides mental effects. Heartburn, indigestion, it weakens the lower esophageal sphincter, increases the risk of this very common problem. It can cause tachycardia, palpitations, arrhythmias. If there's other carcinogens on board, it's a co-carcinogen. It is a drug that has some adverse effects, but I think the primary adverse effect, since our brain is so important, is that decrease in frontal lobe function due to adenosine receptor blockade. Studies have even shown that when you have caffeine on board, you're more likely to gossip than when you don't have it on board. And the definition of gossip that was used was sharing private information with someone who's not part of the problem or part of the solution to the problem. And so this is why some people like to get together and have tea parties, etc., because they like to learn a lot of that private information that may not be best for them to know. Increase in irritability, of course, can occur with it as well. But most people conclude, in my case, I need it. Because without it, I'm a zombie, and I'm not going to be able to function, and yeah, it might be doing these things, but I just have to have it. I need to be stimulated. Well, caffeine addiction turns out to be such a downer that regular coffee drinkers get no real pick-me-up from their morning coffee. This was the Bristol University study. They found that caffeine beverage drinkers develop a tolerance to both the anxiety-producing and the stimulating effects of caffeine, meaning that it only brings them back to baseline levels of alertness, not above them. Now, this was a very well-designed study. Prospective placebo-controlled trials are known as the gold standard study trials. You can't get any better than this in the pharmaceutical industry or in other industries. And so instead of utilizing the actual caffeine, they were using caffeine pills and placebo pills on those that drank caffeine and those that didn't, etc. And what they found out is that although frequent consumers feel alerted by caffeine, especially by their morning tea, coffee, or other caffeine-containing drink, evidence indicates that this is actually merely the reversal of the fatiguing effects of acute caffeine withdrawal. So that's why they're a zombie. It's because they've been utilizing caffeine, and so they have the withdrawal. Measurements showed that the caffeine users' post-caffeine levels of alertness, so this is after they've had their usual dose of caffeine, were actually no higher than the non-caffeine consumers who received a placebo, suggesting caffeine only brings coffee drinkers back up to normal. So what does this tell us? It tells us that all the reported benefits of caffeine are present virtually all day, only in those who don't consume it. So if you want the benefits of caffeine, not just in the morning or not just after your coffee, then quit drinking it. And of course, you will be a zombie for a while. It takes about 3 days of withdrawal. You can get significant headaches. And certainly after 2 weeks, all of those effects are completely gone. And you can have that same level of stimulation without having to reach for that coffee. Well, what does the frontal lobe desire for optimal function? Carbohydrates are used almost exclusively by the brain for optimal function. And the frontal lobe desires those carbohydrates as well. What foods naturally have carbohydrates in them? Fruits, grains, nuts, and vegetables. And that turns out to be the superior diet for the frontal lobe of the brain. Now, back in the 60s, this was 1960s information when this was discovered. I remember I was handed a candy bar in the 3rd grade, and the individual who gave it to me said, "Here, have some brain food." I said, "Really?" And they said, "Yeah, carbohydrates, good for the brain. This candy bar has lots of them. This should be very good for the brain." Well, I was kind of wondering about that, but it wasn't until just a few years later that the Iowa study was done first, and then many other studies showing that large amounts of sugar in the diet actually impair frontal lobe functions. First, it was done in school-age children, then found to be true in adults. Well, why is that the case? Sugar is a carbohydrate. but it's a refined carbohydrate. And when we eat a candy bar, our pancreas thinks we've eaten a large amount of fruits, grains, nuts, and vegetables. So it starts cranking insulin out in huge amounts, and within 30 minutes, that blood sugar is lower than it was before we ate the sugary substance. And that subtle hypoglycemia, of course, what people do then is they tend to snack. They feel a little bit weak, maybe a little bit shaky, and so they start reaching for something else. But even after the blood sugar comes back up again, it takes about 4 hours for the frontal lobe to fully recover from that. So at first, I should mention, even with that subtle hypoglycemia, your temporal lobe can work. So if it's just a memory test, you're going to do all right. But if you're having to think about a problem and problem solve and utilize that analytical portion of the brain, the decision-making portion of the brain, you're not going to do as well, and it makes about a grade letter difference, at least in most subjects. Arachidonic acid is a chemical, 20-carbon chemical that is present primarily in flesh foods, and it decreases the synthesis and storage of acetylcholine, and that can have some inhibitory effect. This was a study, very large study, in fact, the largest study of its kind to date, over 4,000 kids, to try to settle the debate about diet and IQ. And they looked at IQ, 3, 4, 6, and 8.5-year-olds. And then they looked at their diet, and they followed them over time. And this study was programmed for known factors, any known factor that can affect IQ, such as maternal education, maternal social class, maternal age, whether they live in council housing, life events, anything that goes wrong in the home, of course, growing up developmentally can cause some adverse effects on IQ. The home environment, how many books are used, if television is viewed, etc., and how much TV is viewed. And so they controlled for all of those factors because in general, people that come from high IQ homes might have some home environment things that help to foster IQ, etc. So that's why they're really having to control that to make sure it's those things and the genetics and those as much as we can are controlled. And they looked at the 20% with the highest processed diet, in other words, higher in fats and sugar, meat. And they also looked at the other 20% on the other end who ate a more health-conscious diet. In other words, these were people with more fruits, vegetables, salad, pasta, rice, part of the 4 food groups we mentioned that are healthy. Now, very few in the 20% just exclusively ate of that. But it was looking at those that had higher amounts of that and comparing it with the other group. And they showed a definite 5-point difference in IQ. That's pretty significant. And of course, we can even do far better than that by paying attention to the things that we're talking about in this presentation. There's also a reverse effect that occurs that's pretty interesting. By being reverse, in other words, by eating a more plant-based diet, you're likely to have a higher IQ. But it's also shown that if you have a high IQ as a child, you're more likely to become a vegetarian. In fact, children with high IQs definitely more likely to become vegetarians when they grow up. This was a study of 8,000 men and women at age 30 whose IQs had been measured when they were 10. And they showed that the higher the IQ, the greater the odds of them becoming a vegetarian. In fact, for each 15-point rise in IQ scores in the study, the likelihood of becoming a vegetarian by age 30 rose by 38%. Even after adjusting for factors such as social class, they adjusted for factors here too, social class, education, etc., the link was still consistent. Now you remember I told you earlier that people with high IQ have a longevity advantage. And this may be it. As a result of their high IQ, when they come across good information, they're more likely to recognize it as good information and apply that information. You remember IQ is the ability to learn, retain, and apply knowledge. And thus, they have that longevity advantage because that's what they're doing throughout life is learning, applying, or retaining, and applying knowledge. And for those of you who are vegetarians, sometimes you're asked in social settings, why are you a vegetarian? Some people are that way for different reasons, etc. If you don't have a lot of time, you can just answer the quick 2-word answer, high IQ. Now, omega-3 is another way of enhancing your IQ. And omega-3 is present in fish, but it's also present in land plants. And it's also present in sea plants. In fact, fish don't make it themselves. They have to, it's a necessary ingredient for their brain development as well. And there's three types of omega-3, the ALA, the EPA, and the DHA. And animal models reveal that omega-3 feeding favorably influences the function of 23 genes in a brain region known as the hippocampus. So omega-3 has a lot to do with memory. And there are studies indicating that if you're even starting to lose your memory, getting on a higher omega-3 diet, particularly the plant-based DHA, will significantly improve your memory and actually reverse some of those cognitive decline benefits. It also helps out in ways in attentiveness and in learning as well, and focus. It can even help out in some disease conditions, depression and bipolar disorder, and even ADHD to some extent. And of course, the region that it helps the best is the one that's most hit in regards to Alzheimer's. So we do recommend adequate amounts of omega-3. It's the fat that is most deficient in most Western people's diet. Another way of enhancing IQ is through physical exercise. It turns out we are creatures that were designed to exercise, and as we exercise, we improve our circulation. And as that circulation is improved, our brain benefits from that. So physical exercise is an important part of increasing IQ. But it's not just aerobic physical exercise. There's a portion of the brain that controls our hands. And that portion of the brain actually is also in the frontal lobe. It's behind the area that's called the prefrontal cortex. That's our analysis, and that's the spiritual portion. That's where we worship, those type of things. But right behind that is actually where we utilize our hands in functioning with our hands. And studies are showing this is important in regards to IQ. This is Dr. Eric Sigman's work. He had a consensus type where he put some studies together along with others. And he found out that working with one's own hands in a real-world 3D environment is imperative for full cognitive and intellectual development. In fact, he mentions woodwork, metalwork, craft, music, and car mechanic classes are being dropped by many schools. And children seem to want to play computer games at home instead of other games. And as a result, the Western world is becoming a software instead of a screwdriver society. The concern about this is research is showing that increasing time spent in the virtual world of computers is displacing hands-on play and hands-on learning. 3D learning allows young people to experience how the world works in practice, to gain an understanding of materials and processes, and to make informed judgments about abstract concepts. And so we really need, instead of degrading the blue-collar worker or those that are working with their hands, we actually need to be elevating them. They may have some significant brain advantages, and I think it's important for even those in mental work to pick up some sort of habit on a regular basis where they're working with their hands. And there are some significant IQ and EQ advantages to the working with your hands, even in regards to gardening and those type of things. If you're not able to work with your hands in a job-related environment, you really need to pick up a hobby where you can do this, or at least throw the dishwasher away or don't fix it so you can wash dishes. And it doesn't have to be necessarily very intelligent work, just rapid, repetitive type of working with your hands is where it's at. So I would encourage each one of you to embark on this pathway of improving brain performance. Each one of us are able to do this by making some simple lifestyle changes. And so optimize your brain to enhance your intelligence.